Great. Well, welcome everyone. My name is Amy Rose, and I'm a policy associate with Voices for Vermont's Children. Thank you for joining us today as we explore benefits of providing direct cash transfers to youth transitioning out of foster care. We've been using the term universal basic income in our communications because it is a term that more folks are familiar with. But our experts from Chapin Hall will explain why we chose a direct cash transfer, or a DCT, model for Vermont. I want to start by extending my deepest gratitude to Senator Becca White and Representative Dan Noyes for their leadership on this issue. We look forward to sharing companion bills that are in the drafting phase and will hopefully be introduced in the next week or two. Ultimately, our goal is to create policies that are accessible and move us closer to equity. We know that children enter DCF custody in response to trauma. Even when our systems are at their best, youth consistently share that their experiences within the foster care system take time to recover from. When youth exit care without achieving permanency, they are not afforded the safety net that many of their peers have. We know that children who have experienced care have higher rates of homelessness, incarceration, and untimely deaths than their peers. This intervention is intended to offer stability and to soften the transition to independence. Youth transitioning out of care are building their communities. It is important to give them the tools and cash to make choices that support their own well-being. Unconditional direct cash transfers are an important policy tool for improving the well-being of youth and young adults, and they offer a flexible safety net for youth transitioning out of state care. Many thanks to the experts who are joining us here today. We wouldn't be here with the bills on their way without their work. We have a full agenda for today. We will first hear from Sarah and Alesha from Chapin Hall, followed by Michael, a board member and consultant, then Amanda from DCF, and Jessie and Lucy from the Youth Development Program. If you haven't already done so, please take a moment to introduce yourself in the chat. You can use the chat to share thoughts and questions throughout the presentation. Sarah and Alesha, there we go.
Great. Thank you so much, Amy, for this invitation. Alesha and I are so excited to be here with you all today. As Amy said, my name is Sarah Berger Gonzalez. I'm a senior policy analyst with Chapin Hall at the University of Chicago, and really excited to be sharing some of the work that we're doing, some of the research, and most important, and Alesha's going to talk a lot about this, our engagement with young people around direct cash transfers to support youth and young adults. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. This is in presentation mode. Okay, great. So go ahead and get started. So as Amy alluded to, so I'm going to just provide some overall context around direct cash transfers just to kind of ground us in this work, and then I'll talk about how we arrived at direct cash transfers for youth and young adults. So as Amy alluded to, there are a lot of terms that are put out into the space. We talk about universal basic income, guaranteed income, just cash in general. We talk about conditional cash transfers, cash assistance, things like that. At Chapin Hall, we've really landed on the term direct cash transfers for a few reasons. First, each of these terms are great, and at their core, foundational wise, they all really are encompassing the same things. It's really with the exception of conditional cash transfers, but they're typically unconditional cash that, especially guaranteed income and universal basic income, unconditional cash provided regularly over a period of time. At Chapin Hall, we really landed on direct cash transfers as we have really tried to steer away from the word income in particular, recognizing that, again, this is cash going directly to people, it's individuals, and not a voucher or in-kind goods. And the cash piece too, and the cash transfers itself is more all-encompassing. In fact, on the international level, they really often refer to it as income support. So really trying to stay within the word income just for, because again, it means lots of different things when we talk about benefits and taxes, and we'll get to that a little bit later. At Chapin Hall, we also have gone even further to focus on a model called a cash plus model. And I'm going to talk about this in a little bit. But just high level, a cash plus model recognizes that individuals face both financial and non-financial barriers. And so a cash plus model addresses both the financial barriers through the direct cash transfers, and that plus is typically some sort of supportive programming or optional supportive services that really address those non-financial barriers. What's important to all this, and I'm selfless plug, and I can put the link in the chat later. There's a paper that I wrote in my previous position at Stanford Basic Income Lab called What's in a Name. But what's important to recognize too with all of these different terms is that the objectives behind them really do matter. Universal basic income and guaranteed income typically are meant to meet basic needs and can be smaller amounts. Whereas direct cash transfers and some of these other can be larger amounts that maybe, again, what are the objectives behind that? We'll get to that. I'm not going to go too deep into this, but I will just say that there are lots of naysayers around cash transfers. I worked at the World Bank for over a decade on cash transfers, and what I will tell you, it is probably the most rigorously evaluated intervention globally. And through randomized control trials, through all sorts of other evaluations. And what we know is, this is not sort of rocket science, but again, positive effects on reductions in poverty, child and youth outcomes, and well-being. We know that when households, when individuals have that security, they're able to make clearer decisions. We also know that there's positive spillover effects. So where we've seen that maybe cash transfers were for a more targeted population, we know that there are these informal safety nets to some degree where families and neighbors do end up sharing that wealth. And so there are positive spillover effects for cash transfers. Despite, I think what narratives say, individuals are not spending cash on drugs and alcohol. In fact, we know that when people have more cash, their well-being increases, and so they're less likely to be dependent on depressants and things that we would take drugs or alcohol to suppress anxiety and other pieces like that. We also know they're cost effective. I'm going to get to this a little bit, but we know that cash transfers, when they go directly to a household or individual, they know the best things about what they need in that moment. And so we're not sort of spending it for them on something else that we think they need, but they are able to make that decision. And then most importantly, they counter race, class, and gender-based injustices. When we think about the subjectivity sometimes of services or programs, when we give cash directly to individuals, that takes away some of those barriers, because again, you're giving it directly to the individuals to make their best decisions. I talked about the global, the US. We know through a lot of the guaranteed income pilots just how folks are spending it. There's been a huge Stanford Basic Income Lab has a huge data dashboard on how folks are spending money. And again, it's really pointing to basic needs. We've had studies that have been in the US and pilots that have been in the US for cash transfers dating back all the way to the 1960s. In fact, Nixon was a huge proponent of cash transfers, which a lot of folks don't know. But I think when we think about this, like folks, households, individuals, they're spending it on things to their everyday needs. And I would say one thing that wasn't measured in this in some of the early guaranteed income stuff was around housing. So that's also a big one. So why direct cash transfers? Why now? Like, what is this moment, particularly for youth and young adults? So, direct cash assistance is actually not that radical of an idea for 18 to 24-year-olds. In fact, a Merrill Lynch study in 2020 calculated that annually, $500 billion are given to 18 to 24-year-olds in the form of direct cash assistance through parents. And so when we think about young people 18 to 24 who are exiting the child welfare system or who are experiencing homelessness through that they've run away, or they've been in and out of juvenile justice. Again, what we know is that wealth for half of this population, for the 18 to 24-year-olds, is not being passed down. So when we think about that number, $500 billion, and this is not including big ticket items like weddings or buying a house. This is just in general for education, for cars, for everyday expenses. That is how much households for the medium to high wealth households are spending on or passing down in cash assistance. So it's already happening naturally. So when we think about this for the other half of the 18, 24-year-olds, ultimately, like, this is an equity issue, but this is also an issue, like, we want to ensure that every 18 to 24-year-old has equal opportunity to thrive. So direct cash transfers, really, it's what young people want and need. They are the experts of their own lives, and they're making decisions just like all 18 to 24-year-olds. Are they going to make decisions that might not end up resulting in the outcome that they wanted? Absolutely. But this is the 18 to 24-year-old. That's a developmental period of life where those who are receiving the $500 billion in cash assistance are able to do that. So we should have that same developmental expectation across. Current interventions are currently failing to achieve population impact. And we think about this a lot in the youth homelessness space. So if we give young people cash, we are really trying to understand, is that more effective than putting them in a shelter or having them go in and out of drop-in center for emergency assistance or emergency housing, or even looking at the effectiveness against a rapid rehousing program or permanent supportive housing. They're often sometimes more geared toward older adults or families. It's fast, flexible, and scalable. So when we think about cash, in fact, during 2020 and 2021, cash transfers increased by $400 billion across the world because this was the most fast and flexible, scalable solution, getting people cash. So again, that they could make the purchases they needed to support themselves. It's an instrument for racial and LGBTQ equity and justice. Again, really pulling away some of that subjectivity and that paternalism on this is what you need to spend the cash on to here's the cash and you're the expert of your own life. It's cost efficient. We're, again, really trying to reduce administrative barriers for administering this, and it has the potential for positive spillover effects. I wanted to just put this slide in here real quick because I think it's a really important point when we think about cash and cash assistance. And I've touched a little bit on narrative in the US, but when we think about it as a tool for racial equity. So if the narrative is really about the principles behind direct cash transfers, right? The narrative should be that it's for justice, right? We're really trying to undo some of these paternalistic and more oppressive policies and really give individuals the power, the choice, the agency to make those decisions for themselves. We also are moving away from charity. We're not doing it out of charity. We're doing it because we want young people to have that agency, right? Cash goes directly to an individual family. I've already talked about this quite a bit. They're the expert of their own lives versus going to a second party or a landlord. We have, and I'm going to talk about this in the next 2 slides or next 3 slides, but we have really emphasized the importance of designing this work, processes, the amounts, all these pieces with young people with lived expertise. Because if we don't, then it just becomes this top-down approach and we're essentially just repeating the same. We focus deeply on process, and process matters because if we're thinking about this from scalability perspective, if we're thinking about this from an equity perspective, if we're thinking about this from a justice perspective and what processes have not been done correctly, this is an opportunity for us to systematically rethink and creatively create processes that young people would resonate with, versus just focusing on getting out as much cash as possible, as quickly as possible to the most number of people. We design with trust and agency. I like to brag about this, but we are one of the few, Chapin Hall is supporting 6 pilots at the moment We're one of the few groups in the country that we are not monitoring how young people spend their money. We really do truly believe that, again, young people have said to us they want us to trust them. And so we're saying, yes, then we trust you. So our focus is really on outcomes and not necessarily on the amount being spent. And we feel like that's also can be a social control piece. So ultimately, our impact is around economic and racial justice and not necessarily having the flashiest direct cash transfer. And sometimes that means, taking a step back, and it might mean a longer process for design. It might mean there's more hurdles and roadblocks, but ultimately that this is done in partnership with young people with lived expertise to be at the center of this and help making the decisions in this. So I'm going to transition a little bit to the Pathways Study and Trust Youth Initiative, which is the work that we're doing at Chapin Hall. And hopefully this will provide some context. I have some questions at the end for the group to consider in the design for Vermont. And Alesha is going to talk about the work that we've done, particularly around the policy work in reducing barriers to young people's pathways to thriving. So I have been in cash transfers for a very long time, as I alluded to earlier. And while I love cash transfers, they are just a tool, just like any other tool. They are not a silver bullet. And we have to think about them as a tool and as part of a larger system. And so back in 2019, Chapin Hall carried out a youth homelessness systems assessment of New York City. And this was really built on the request from New York City to have a deeper understanding of what are they doing well, what are they not doing well, and what do they need to be doing to really address some of these challenges. In parallel, Chapin Hall also did a systems assessment, a national systems assessment of the youth homelessness space. And again, both of these dovetailed onto the Voices of Youth Count work. I'm sure many of you might be familiar with it. If not, again, I'll put all these links in the chat. But what these systems assessments really pointed out was two things. One, we know about the critical factors that contribute to increases or likelihood of youth homelessness. We know that if a young person has been in and out of juvenile justice or system involved, we know pregnant and parenting, we know if they've lost a family member, or particularly a parent at an early age. We know that if they've experienced homelessness at a young age, all these factors are critical factors for knowing that this young person would experience homelessness. What we have very little information on, apart from point-in-time counts, is young people's pathways through and out of homelessness, the services they use, the programs they use, their movement throughout states or out of states, their movement in with other family members. We really do not have a clear understanding of this. And so as we continue to put more and more money towards services, we're sort of saying, let's take a step back and have a clear understanding of what young people's pathways are, so that we can have services that are really meeting the needs or the gaps that young people are identifying. So that was one. The other piece was that there's a lot of housing options out there, but in fact, a lot of them are not really geared for young people. They're not flexible. Young people spend long periods of time in shelters, which can be extremely harmful, traumatizing, and often they're put into housing programs that, again, are really geared toward older adults or for families. In fact, 3% nationally, 3% of vouchers go to young people 18 to 24. So again, really thinking about these two challenges or problems around not really having that clear understanding of young people's pathways through and out of homelessness, together with needing something that's more creative and flexible. And so what we did at Chapin Hall is we carried out a collaborative process with New York City's Youth Action Board and a handful of other individuals, youth with lived expertise from across the country, to arrive at basically a foundational piece for really creating a direct cash transfer program for young people. These are the core elements. This, again, I keep promising these links. I'll put these links out in the chat. But young people said it needs to be centered on youth, equity, and trust. So again, really getting to that point of trusting us, ensuring that young people who are receiving the direct cash transfers are often the ones that are at the margins. They're not at the front door knocking constantly. They're typically the ones that are least likely to come into the drop-in, or dropping in only periodically. They're the ones that get stuck in the shelter system and are just in it for long periods of time. Or they're the ones sort of coming and saying, like, I'm really struggling, but the coordinated entry process doesn't deem them quite eligible enough for housing. So again, centering on youth, equity, and trust. We really wanted, and through this process, young people said, we really want to ensure that the goal is around boosting housing stability, empowerment, agency, well-being. And so again, that being a key objective or a key goal. So ensuring that the cash plus, or the cash and the non-cash part of it, really are addressing that piece. Identify and manage barriers to success, recognizing again that it's not just the financial piece that young people face, but there are other barriers that are success to being housed, staying stably housed, and investing in themselves. And then adopting a flexible and simple approach. The last thing young people said over and over again, and they continue to reiterate, is don't create more processes on top of processes. Streamline this. Have a team that is cheering us on, supporting us through this process. So we landed on these objectives for the cash transfer. The objectives are for young people to achieve safe and stable housing, have improved well-being, increase their human capital formation, whether it be through investments in education, employment, moving away from 3 jobs to maybe 1, again, to really invest in themselves. Agency, racial and LGBTQ equity, and ensuring again that those young people who are typically not at the front and center, who are necessarily the loudest voice, really are having access to something like this, and are creating a more equitable approach to supporting housing and well-being and cost effectiveness. So these are all the objectives that we're really focusing on. The focus of the population is 18 to 24-year-olds. In all of these sites, so I've mentioned, we're working in New York, San Francisco, Oakland, LA County, Minnesota, Boston, and Baltimore is possibly going to be joining this larger cohort. They're recruited through drop-in centers or shelter programs. They're currently experiencing homelessness, and this is by any federal definition, because again, we understand that young people experiencing homelessness, youth homelessness is fluid. So again, it's not necessarily literal homelessness. And they're not expected to have a permanent housing solution, meaning that they're not leased up already with a voucher. So this cash transfer that we're doing in all these different sites is really aimed at creating a larger evidence base around the effectiveness of cash transfers to support young people's safe and stable housing. And it's to get to that other point that the systems assessment showed, which is understanding young people's pathways through and out of homelessness. So to do this, young people are first invited to a pathway study, and this really gets at the evaluation piece of the cash, but it also is like a 2-for-1 evaluation of the cash, but also this having a better understanding of the pathways. So young people are invited to the pathway study. It's a longitudinal study, meaning it's up at least 3 years of data collection, but it's over time. So young people receive participate in survey check-ins 30 times over the course of 2.5 years. And this is then combined with one-on-one interviews and focus groups to really understand their experiences with systems, with services, with programs over time. And all young people are paid for their participation in this. Half of those young people are then invited to participate in the Trust Youth Initiative program. They do not know at the start of the study that they know that they could be invited to additional programs, but the cash was not talked about up front. Young people have told us that this can be coercive and re-traumatizing, particularly if they find out about it up front and they don't end up getting it in the second time around. So young people are then, half the young people are invited to the cash plus model. So again, it's cash and optional supportive programming. What I want to point out here is, I'm sure there's maybe some sticker shock for some of you who are looking at this and saying, oh my gosh, $30,000 paid unconditionally over 24 months. That's a lot of money. It is a lot of money. And this amount was not just arrived at, because we felt like this is, we felt like everyone should choose $1,000 or $500. We really go through a process in each of these sites, thinking critically, looking at data, particularly HUD's FMR for a shared bedroom, a shared apartment is what we really try and ground this in. And then we also do a lot of adaptation consultations with young people to really arrive on what makes the most sense, what is going to support that outcome around safe and stable housing, really thinking about that housing first piece. What's going to really ensure that they can pay rent. Again, it's unconditional and it's unrestricted. They don't have to spend it on rent, but it's an amount large enough that it would support a young person to have a housing share. So in this case, in New York, they are paid, or not New York, sorry, in Minnesota, they're paid $1,100 a month, or $550 twice a month. Young people said they wanted to receive it around the 1st and the 15th, similar to a paycheck. And again, that's a regular payment for 24 months. In addition to that, in the co-design process, young people said, you know what, we also face a lot of barriers to exiting homelessness. Like, what I want to rent an apartment, but I don't have first or last month's rent, or even a security deposit, or I have this debt that's preventing me from improving my credit to even let a landlord look at a lease with me. So they said it would be fantastic to have a one-time amount that they could access at any point over those 24 months. In New York, that's $3,000. In other places, again, it's really a conversation of what are the costs to exiting homelessness and being stably housed. We use a platform that, again, allows multiple payout options. Young people said they really want to ensure that they have choice in how they receive the cash. Really important when we think about undocumented individuals, transition age youth who are in the process of transitioning and going through a name change. We've had to work with a few young people in New York as they've gone through this process to ensure that, again, our banking system is really binary, and so, or not binary, but it's very much this is your name, and there's no changes until they see the legal documents. And so that raises flags for financial reasons. And so it's important to ensure that you have multiple options. So as a young person is navigating this with support, that when the name is finally changed, then it can be changed on the financial end, the banking end, to continue to receive those direct cash transfers. And then, as I mentioned too, young people said there was they really didn't love all the services, just a crazy amount, but what they really wanted was a team to support them around housing navigation. So not just getting leased up, but having tough conversations around roommates, with landlords. They wanted financial coaching, setting goals around budgets, addressing credit issues, things like that. And then really providing trauma-informed care, recognizing that over the years, that a lot of it had not been addressed in a way that they felt was appropriate. I realize I'm talking for a long time. I just want to point out from the slide, again, we'll share out the slide decks, but we really are trying to build a model here for scale. And I think I touched on this in the beginning, the importance of ensuring that when building a pilot program, it's great because you get all those kinks, right? You start small, but then when you're building for scale, thinking about what's the infrastructure you need to have in place for, for payments, doing that important policy analysis around taxes and public benefits, and ensuring that there's actionable evidence so that legislatures, taxpayers, they're not following the narrative they have in their head, but they're really grounding it and basing it in actionable evidence. I'm going to stop talking and pass it over to my colleague, Alesha, who's going to talk about our youth engagement in this project, and in particular around the policy toolkit, which I think a lot of you will have questions on with regard to the interaction of cash with public benefits. So, Alesha.
Thank you, Sarah. So this was really a huge effort to get this policy toolkit off the ground. So we thought it was important to really inform people, especially policymakers, districts, people implementing direct cash transfers into their organizations uh, around what does tax implications, what are the Medicaid implications, cash and food, post-secondary financial aid, federal rental assistance, what are their implications on direct cash transfers, and how is this going to affect young people when they navigate these systems? Next slide, please. I'm going to try to be as quick as I can. So the impetus for the policy toolkit, so there are cities and counties, they were interested in cash plus model to end youth homelessness. There was a need to navigate taxes and public benefits, especially for young people. I know myself, I've experienced homelessness and navigating public benefits and taxes at a young age can be arduous. And so having a toolkit in place to navigate these systems is very important for program design and for the youth themselves. It was to ensure net benefit does not produce new forms of inequality or diminished benefits, especially for youth and young adults experiencing homelessness or housing instability. It was there to inform design of models and identify policy and programmatic approaches. Sorry, my words are spilling over today. Again, I'm trying to get through this fast because other people are talking. So what we did, we worked with youth and young adults to inform the design and content of the toolkit. That meant facilitating conversations and inviting youth voice. And they came up, the young adult consultants we worked with came up with really good questions that then we let the experts know, the people who are the authors of this toolkit, like this is the perspective of young people. You should include this in your paper. We had interactive webinar series. I hope some of you were able to attend, but if you haven't, that's okay. It was great, but the toolkit exists for you to like read the where all of this came from. We developed the white papers for formal review process. Again, young people were also a part of that review process, and they had great insight as well. And then we created a comprehensive toolkit that deep dives into complex policy implications. And I don't know if it's in the chat right now, but I'm going to put a link to the toolkit there. So like it's a good read. It can be a long read, but like it's very important. And next slide, please. So key takeaways, design matters. So from the tax implications part of the toolkit, it was best decided that you should, or programs should, structure the payments, direct cash transfers as a gift to eliminate any barriers around like filing taxes for both the young people and organizations implementing DCTs. When possible, use a blend of public and private funds to finance the cash transfers. That's very important. Analyze local, state, and federal landscapes. So like truly tap into the partners in your area and get them on board as well. Take a multi-pronged approach. So make sure it's programmatic, youth-informed decision-making, and policy, especially youth-informed. Next slide, please. Consideration for designing a DCT. So who is the population that we're focusing on? Ideally, it's young people experiencing homelessness, but for the purpose of this talk, it's young people aging out of a child welfare or the foster care system. What is the challenge? So what are the financial barriers? What are the non-financial barriers? All of these are questions you should consider. What is the objective of the direct cash transfers? How are you looking at this in terms of a housing intervention? What is the desired short-term outcomes, long-term outcomes? What is the process, scalability? All of these things you should really keep in mind when designing a direct cash transfer. Is there a next slide?
No, that's it.
I think the last thing before we end is like to make sure when implementing a direct cash transfer that young people are well informed. Benefits counseling is a great way to really approach that conversation. There might be young people who receive Medicaid, Medicare, and if when you have navigating those conversations, like really allowing the young person to be like, if I lose Medicaid, is the direct cash transfer going to make up for that loss? And as a young person, they should be able to make that decision. You as a program designer or a person implementing or organization implementing that program should make that decision for the young person. They are the experts of their lived expertise, and they know what they need for, they know their basic needs, and you should trust them in that. Yes, I think that's all I needed to share. Pass it on to Amy.
Thank you so much. That was incredibly helpful, and we're so fortunate to have your expertise to build off of in Vermont. Our next speaker is Mike Hill, who is a board member of Voices. As he said in the chat, he's also a consultant and has lived experience in this realm. Michael, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Amy. And I just want to say thank you all for joining this conversation and this lunch conversation. I can't remember the fancy name that we called it. I also want to acknowledge Sarah and Alesha. Thank you so much for the work that you're doing. I really am not going to take that much space up at all. I just wanted to speak to the reality around like Voices for Vermont Children. As a board member, we're very passionate about the work that you are doing, as well as every other aspect of movement and transformational work that centers youth and young adults in navigating our inequitable systems and our oppressive and discriminatory structures. And so this is very close to my heart for direct personal reasons and as well as indirect personal reasons. And I want to acknowledge Lucy and I want to acknowledge Jessie for the work they do as YDP and direct youth service providers. Also, this is in the works, but I want to just acknowledge how impactful this is in regards to parallel policies. For example, there's work being done with Vermont's Children, Youth, and Family Services and in regards of creating a affirming housing policy, which already exists for LGBTQ plus and questioning youth and young adults, but one is being created and cultivated for those of the global majority of children who are non-white identified. And I think that policy and the work that you are doing, Sarah and Alesha are doing, are parallel, because from my experience in the foster care system, I was fortunate enough to not age out. I was fortunate enough to be reunited with my parent, with my father, but I had friends who did age out. I had friends who could have used this assistance. And the parallel aspect of that affirming policy is that if they're being put with foster care parents or guardians who understand the the systems and the navigation of the systems that they have to deal with, that's even more powerful with them growing and learning everything that they need to learn so that they can be as successful as possible when they age out. And so I just wanted to speak to how we're doing such amazing work and how all the work that we're doing is connective. And also when doing policy work or policy development work, it shouldn't be siloed. It should be in collaboration, or we should think about how can one policy impact another policy, and therefore. So that's all I wanted to say. And I really just want to reiterate, thank you so much for bringing us to Vermont.
Thank you so much, Mike. I deeply appreciate you and all of the work that you do. Next up, we have Amanda from DCF. It's been really helpful to think through ideas on multiple policy levels with Amanda over the years, and I appreciate you being here and willing to share a little bit more about what the picture looks like right now in Vermont.
Hi, yeah, thanks so much for having me. Amanda Churchill. I'm an adolescent policy and practice specialist with DCF Family Services. I've been working with or on behalf of transition age youth for about 20 years. My primary focus at DCF is on the population of youth who experience foster care later in adolescence and ensuring transition and aftercare services for those folks. Today, I just wanted to give you a quick sense with some data of the adolescent foster care population in Vermont, and I have a couple of slides to show you. Currently, there are approximately 300 youth in custody over the age of 14 in Vermont. And although some youth age out of custody each year, many youth do not turn 18 and in custody and will reunify or exit to family or may be adopted before that time. Regardless of how and when youth exit, we aim to ensure that all youth who have touched the foster care system are connected to or at least aware of the transitional services that are available in Vermont. Also, I just want to point out in 2020, Annie E. Casey published some national data indicating that there were about 1,850 youth ages 14 to 23 who've been in foster care in Vermont in the past or currently, which is a big number. And because of our limited resources, we're not able to serve everyone who's eligible. And in fact, our transition and aftercare program, which we'll talk a little bit more about, we call the Youth Development Program in Vermont, and it's also part of our Chapin program. We're only working with about like a quarter to a third of the youth who are eligible. So on this chart, we see a curve with more 16-year-olds in care than other age groups. This is an age where we see a higher number of youth entering custody, but also those, many youth are exiting custody at that age as well. So there are several, many youth who are in care at age 16 who won't turn 18 in custody, whereas like those who are 17, there's a higher likelihood that those folks may turn 18 in foster care. And that's the population who, we really generally want to target the most with resources, as those are often the folks who are, may have fewer natural supports and resources, connections available to help as they move to young adulthood. The other piece I just wanted to show folks, in 2022, there were actually about 36% fewer youth who turned 18 in foster care as compared to 2019. So, my sense of that is that this is a product of there being fewer youth in custody in general in Vermont. More recently, and also more youth exiting to permanency prior to 18. I don't have longitudinal permanency data available today, but that's my sense based on what I see happening through my work with the district offices. I appreciate what Sarah and Michael talked about in terms of like, why this focus is important from an equity lens. And again, I don't have the Vermont data to share on this today, but we do know from the national data and also like anecdotally through our work that older youth who turn 18 in foster care in Vermont are disproportionately identified as people of color, non-white, LGBTQ+. And we do see this supporting this population as an equity piece, and really important to make sure that resources are available for folks who need them and want them. The other piece I wanted to talk to folks about today is around the resources that are currently available for youth in Vermont. We categorize these services as DCF extended care and YDP extended care. So there's a few key differences there. For our DCF extended care services, youth remain in high school. It's primarily an extension of their pre-18, foster care / group care setting. There are a small number of youth who are supported to live independently, and those youth receive a small stipend of about $600 a month. I did want to share that there's not a huge uptake for DCF extended care, and our hypothesis around that, again, through our work, is that a lot of youth may already be done with high school, or they may not want to continue working with DCF, or they may want to return to or reside in environments that DCF isn't able to support for a variety of reasons. And then in terms of YDP, the youth development programs, extended care offerings, those folks that access YDP extended care are closed by DCF. They access services through the YDP case management services. We do have an extended foster care option through YDP extended care as well, that doesn't require youth to be in high school. But again, we do have like a smaller than expected uptake for those services, probably for the similar reasons that youth aren't accessing DCF extended care. Some rigidity in terms of what youth have access to. We had an independent living pilot that over the last 2 years that was pretty successful, but time limited due to the budget, and we're not currently accepting new agreements, but it was successful. I think Jessie is going to talk more about that next. The only other resource that I would, I think folks talked about this, we do have access to FYI vouchers that are like Section 8 for youth who have experienced foster care. We have 20 vouchers available in Vermont, and we actually do have some capacity in that program. Biggest barriers for youth in Vermont around, using FYI vouchers are around like the lack of affordable housing. There just really is no housing stock in Vermont, and youth are competing with a lot of other people for the apartments that are available and affordable. And the other barriers like access to the required support services. And then, I think we also just see in our work with youth, and a lot of youth at 18 are just not ready to pursue, that level of independent living in an apartment on their own, and often pursue other types of, resources or, more informal housing arrangements before taking that step. So that is what I wanted to share with you folks. And so from here, I think I can turn it over to Jessie to talk more about the youth development program and the good work happening there.
Sure, thank you, Amanda. I just want to be mindful of time. I thank everybody for sticking around since it's almost 1, and I'll try to be as succinct as possible. So my name is Jessie Warren. My pronouns are he, him, and I am the statewide director of YDP. the Youth Development Program. And I'm joined here today by Lucy, our Youth Advocacy Coordinator. So I'm just going to talk to you about this program and how it relates to our conversation today. So YDP is a statewide program that supports youth ages 14 to 23 who have experience in foster care. We contract with DCF in Vermont and we're funded through the state. Our mission is to ensure that youth in foster care or have had any experience in care enter adulthood with the necessary support to build productive and fulfilling lives, just like anybody else should. Our youth development coordinators are our case managers throughout the state who partner with youth to help them explore interests, set goals, make connections, and transition into adulthood. Our most recent outcomes have shown that 92% of youth participating in YDP feel connected to a supportive adult, 99% of those youth have health insurance, and 88% are stably housed. YDP also supports youth in getting involved in leadership and advocacy opportunities, such as through youth panels that Lucy facilitates, DCF trainings, our youth advocacy board, and our annual YDP conference. Something that's unique about our state is that YDP offers youth investment grants, as Amanda kind of touched on, but that's our flexible funding that supports a youth's goals and interests. This can include anything from funding for transportation, like driver's ed, getting their license, housing, rent support, normalcy activities, and enrichment activities like going to prom, basic needs, employment, education, really the list goes on. These funds are meant to meet youth where they're at and are especially impactful during that transitional age when someone ages out of foster care at 18 to 23. However, by the end of the fiscal year, these funds for YDP are extremely tight and we're not funded enough to meet the various needs of the youth throughout our state. We're currently serving only about 30% of eligible youth, and we're stretching our resources extremely thin in order to do that. For the past 2 fiscal years, YDP was the recipient of a supplemental Chapin grant that was intended to support organizations through COVID-19. And with that additional funding, YDP developed a pilot program called the ILS, or Independent Living Stipends, which is a $500 flexible monthly stipend that is distributed directly to youth. The case managers of YDP distribute these funds, and they can be really helpful in navigating conversations about budgeting or anything else that comes up around that. This pilot program was extremely successful in creating stability for these folks who have historically lacked that their entire lives. Our data also shows that the rates of youth experiencing stable housing has increased since the implementation of these stipends. But like Sarah said, these stipends are flexible, so they allow the youth to be the expert of their own life and have autonomy over how they spend this money. They don't have to spend it on housing if that doesn't make sense for them. It's also important that I note that the $500 monthly for this pilot is not enough funding. $1,000 a month would be much more manageable, especially if the youth is using this towards rent. Because in Vermont specifically, we all know that there's a huge housing crisis. 1 bedrooms on average can go up to like $1,700 depending on where you live in the state. So in conclusion, the direct cash transfer pilot that we are talking about today could really build upon and better what we already have going with the independent living stipends at YDP. And we've seen that YDP is a successful conduit to distribute these stipends to youth who need them. And maybe I'll kick it to Amanda or Lucy.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. My name is Lucy Bolognese. I'm the Youth Advocacy Coordinator for YDP. And I just really wanted to share some just anecdotal evidence. As the advocacy coordinator, I have an interesting and unique opportunity to talk to youth and young adults who have transitioned or are transitioning in a sort of less case management atmosphere and more of a kind of just supportive adult advocacy atmosphere. And I've seen and heard stories from youth who have transitioned or are transitioning who would really benefit from universal basic income or direct cash transfer. I'm thinking especially of one young person in particular. They have, I believe, 2 young children, have experienced homelessness, identify as LGBTQ, and they are working, I think, 50+ hours a week at their sales job just to make ends meet. And I know that a universal basic income or direct cash transfer would be super helpful. They've been amazing and made time for advocacy, even with their tough work schedule and their family commitments. But I know that, you know, it's a struggle for a lot of these young people. And I think that, you know, there's a lot of other things that come with being involved with the foster care child welfare system, like, you know, a lot of mental health things come up, a lot of kind of medical things can come up. And, you know, I know another youth who is facing a lot of medical bills who would really benefit from some extra money on hand. So I think just anecdotally, I'm hearing a lot of this, you know, similar stories, but all, you know, saying the same thing, that these people, these are support and more support from the government and more support just in general. And it's really awesome. And I'm very hopeful that this initiative, this program can succeed. So thank you all.
Thank you, everyone. I really appreciate everyone for joining us today. I'm so glad that we recorded it because I think there's just so much expertise in this last hour that I need to go back and listen again to make sure that I've caught all of the information. Before we wrap up, I want to pass the conversation over to Kit, who is our communications director and navigated all of the Zoom and setup and communications for this event. So she can share a little bit more about how this fits into our larger lunchtime learning series. Oh, you're muted.
Hi. Should know that by now. Hi, everybody. As most of you know, Voices for Vermont's Children is a multi-issue policy organization focused on promoting public policy that centers equity and justice for children, youth, and families in Vermont. And one of the things that as an organization we're continually reflecting on is this balance between or sort of uplifting and centering the lives and experiences of children and youth in Vermont and building a bridge to the larger community that we're a part of. So, you know, because I think that this work by its very nature is relational and it often takes place outside of the spotlight. So right as we were entering into the start of the session, Amy came to me with this wonderful idea and said, hey, what if we start bringing together folks to share and discuss and reflect on the issues that we're talking and thinking about and working on in the legislature. So we recently just wrapped up a series in January focused on Reach Up. And in this, we've decided the series has been so successful that we're going to kind of continue it for the foreseeable future. And next week on February 16th, we have our next session, which will be focused on paid family and medical leave. And following that, we have one coming up on March 9th that is going to be a discussion focusing on community doulas in Vermont. And I have I put links to both the events so that you can register and to our mailing list in the chat. And after this, we'll follow up and share resources and the recording with all of you. And that goes for upcoming sessions too. So even if you can't make it, it's a great opportunity just to connect to resources and others who are engaged in this work. And so, yeah, hope you can continue to join us. And thank you so much for your time and just for being here. All right. Thanks a lot, everybody.
Thank you
Thanks
all.
again, everyone.
Great to
Thank
be
you.
with
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.